You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 28th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, has Emmanuel Macron wagered a bet too far in the French parliamentary elections? The legendary francophone journalist Christine Ockrent will join me to look ahead at a weekend that could start to reshape France. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes, Biden and Trump go head-to-head in the first presidential debate of 2024.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
We will go through an agonising 90 minutes. Andrew Tuck will talk to us about the new Monocle Paris bureau, plus the newspapers and why Barcelona made it to this year's Quality of Life Top 20.
The city government is responding to that through progressive taxation and through consultation with citizens, and it is having a material effect on the lives of the people who live there.
That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. European Union leaders have agreed to nominate Germany's centre-right politician Ursula von der Leyen for a second five-year term as President of the European Commission. The former Portuguese Premier António Costa is the future chair of the European Council, and the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas will be the next EU foreign policy chief. At least 6 people have been killed after an international express train collided with a bus on a level crossing in Slovakia. And schools in the US state of Oklahoma have been ordered to incorporate the Bible into their lessons. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, how loudly are the far right knocking at the gates of power in France? This weekend, a nation shocked into voting in unexpected parliamentary elections could deliver an even bigger shock, if the polls are correct, by handing up to 35% of its votes to Marine Le Pen's National Rally. And not just that, second place is expected to go to a left-wing alliance with the centrist party of President Emmanuel Macron trailing at around 20%. Well, I'm joined now by the journalist and writer Christine Ockrent. A very good morning to you, Christine.
Good morning, Emma.
In all your experience, have you ever seen anything like this in terms of the way that France is reshaping itself?
No, it's an absolute shock, and people are really in disarray because whatever political opinions may be, the shock of Macron's decision, which was totally unexpected, even if his own political party did very poorly at the European elections. The fact that we have the Olympic Games coming up in less than 3 weeks, and the idea that the extreme right could very legitimately be running the country with a prime minister 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, who has never held any other job other than the party job, it's quite something. And overall, people are really, really shocked.
There is a real sense, though, that there'll be a very high turnout this weekend because it has absolutely spurred France into sort of political consciousness, hasn't it?
Well, you know, I mean, the saying goes that the French love politics. Like in any other democracy, there has been less confidence in political parties per se, which is why Macron himself managed to be elected in 2017 without holding on to a political party. That was his bet. And so now people will indeed show up on Sunday and the following Sunday, because our electoral system is very different from the British one, as you know. There will indeed be a high turnout. What will be interesting will be to see the level of young people's involvement, because they love Bardella on TikTok. Will they go as far as going to the voting booth? That remains to be seen.
It does explain a little bit about Jordan Bardella, this 28-year-old, this young man who feels as if he was born a politician. And it is, just as you say, it is TikTok which has propelled him forward, isn't it?
Well, I think we have to get used, that social media politics, that's the new way of our societies to function. And of course, all style politicians are at a loss to adjust. And but indeed, people of Bardella's generation think, what a good-looking guy, and he uses simple words, and we understand what he says. And nobody really gives much interest into rational arguments anymore. And that was pretty obvious in the TV debate last night, as it was in the previous TV debate on Tuesday night. Rational arguments do not have any impact.
Let's have a listen, actually, to Jordan Bardella in last night's debate on France 2. It's a slightly extended clip where he talks about, he sort of addresses immigration in the most astonishingly deft way. Let's have a listen.
Il y a aujourd'hui beaucoup de quartiers en France où il ne fait bon de n'être ni juif, ni homosexuel, ni une femme. Parce que précisément, on a fait venir sur le sol français, grâce aux politiques que vous soutenez, des gens qui rejettent toute forme de différence. Dans le département dans lequel j'ai grandi.
On a aussi arrêté de faire sujet verbe immigration en permanence. On a parlé de...
Okay, let's have a quick summary of that, Christine. It's basically, that's Jordan Bardella saying that there are areas in France where you can't be Jewish, you can't be gay, and you can't be a woman because of the immigration policies of the existing government. That's an astonishing statement from the far right, isn't it?
Exactly. And it's, of course, it's very clever because of Gaza and the sort of very excessive pro-Palestinian movements supported by the extreme left in France, as in other countries. The far right has managed to appear as the protector of French Jews. And indeed, many of those will be voting for the Rassemblement National. So in one sentence, Bardella manages to appear as the protector of Jews, the protector of gays, whereas there are many candidates that the Rassemblement National will be supporting next Sunday who are known to be homophobic. And then, of course, the third dimension, of course, is women. Marine Le Pen and Le Pen family being the girls of the daughters of the old guy. But it's all very clever. And I think that sums up very well the tactics of the Rassemblement National.
Just explain a little bit about, you mentioned at the start, the sort of shock that France experienced when it was told it was going to the polls on Sunday. The President, Emmanuel Macron, has said that this will offer clarification. I mean, this is his fight alone, isn't it? Because nobody else seemed to be either expecting or indeed wishing this to happen.
No, but of course there's a cynical analysis saying what really matters eventually is the presidential election, which is due in 3 years. So is Macron's calculus that once the extreme right in charge, the French will realize that they are really incompetent. They have only so far been running 2 small towns in the country, not with great efficiency. So would the calculation be that during the next 3 years, the performance will be so abysmal that indeed the French will not elect Marine Le Pen as the next French president? So that could be a dimension of Macron's thinking. But if so, it is, another tragic bet on history, and who knows what will happen. And of course, not even to mention the issue about French influence within the European Union, the war in Ukraine, and the forthcoming American presidential election. I mean, it's quite suffocating.
Tell us a little bit about how this system could work over the next 3 years. If we do have, as is expected, a parliamentary majority or a large presence in the French parliament of the far right, of the National Rally, but we have Emmanuel Macron as president, they enter into what's known as cohabitation, don't they? How is that expected to work?
Well, there have been previous experiences of the same kind. Cohabitation. There was a cohabitation between Mitterrand and Chirac, and there was a cohabitation, that is to say, a socialist president and a conservative prime minister. Then a cohabitation between conservative Chirac and socialist prime minister Jospin. And it worked because those belonged to a generation who knew they were professional politicians. They knew about the ropes and the rules of the game. And of course, there were frictions, there were crises about some issues. But on the whole, the process did work. And the French rather liked it because they felt they had a bit of both worlds. And so wasn't it nice? In this particular case, it will be, it's much more, how could I put it? It's much more of an interrogation because who are the people who will be put forward to form a Rassemblement National government? Even Marine Le Pen in the past few days made two huge blunders showing that she hasn't read the Constitution about the legitimacy and the power of the French president according to the Constitution regarding defense, for instance. So there will be obviously, a great deal of question marks as to who will be the people forming the government and how will the rules of the game actually function.
Let's talk a little bit about the international reputation of France. I mean, you've touched on the fact that we are just about to start the Olympics in a moment of political turmoil, which was not expected. And you also mentioned Ukraine. And Jordan Bardella, the leader of the National Rally, he said that they will not send Kyiv long-range missiles and other weapons that could strike Russian territory. This is a reversal of the policy of Emmanuel Macron. This change in government, if it happens in Parliament, could profoundly affect France's role on the stage.
Yes, of course. But then again, Bardella is very careful and very firm now, saying we will protect Ukraine, whatever happens. We have been supporting it from the start. And he does everything. I mean, the wording and the firmness of his statements. The purpose is to the hope is that people will forget that it's actually Putin who lended money to Le Pen so that she could pay her dues in a former election campaign. And the far right has traditionally been supportive of Russia. But in this case, Bardella has been very clever, there again, in turning against Russia and saying Russia is the aggressor and will do everything to support Ukraine, short of sending those long-range French missiles and sending French troops on the ground. And of course, we will be an eager member of NATO. That again is a complete reversal of a posture concerning the far right. So it's all, how could I put it, melding, showing how the capacity of adaptation of Bardella as their leader, and indeed Marine Le Pen as the forthcoming eventual next French president, and their followers in getting into the idea that they will be indeed heading a nuclear power, playing an important role in European and international politics.
Christine Ockrent, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Mount Fuji and efforts to protect and preserve the legendary landmark have hit the headlines recently, from building a screen to stop tourists taking photos to an entire newly built apartment block being torn down to preserve the view. One of the reasons why is because visitors and climbers find it irresistible, and in some cases dangerously so. Well, climbing season is just about to begin, and there have already been problems and tragedies. Fiona Wilson is Monocle's Asia editor and Tokyo bureau chief. She joins me now. Good afternoon, Fiona.
Hi, Emma.
So we've already seen at least 4 people die, and as I mentioned a moment ago, climbing season hasn't even started yet.
That's right. So the climbing season starts officially on the 1st of July, as it does every year, goes on until September the 10th. And people are really encouraged not to climb outside the climbing season. So on Wednesday, 4 bodies were found, people who died summiting it's a very, very tall mountain. I have to say, Fuji, people might not realize this, but it's 3,700 plus meters. So it's a very serious mountain. And people who climb out of season generally are very good climbers. One of the climbers who died is quite a famous climber, Keita Kurakami. Seems he'd had a heart condition, so that may have contributed to what happened to him. But yeah, it's a proper climb. And I think sometimes people think, so many people do it, how difficult can it be?
So just explain to us, what the Japanese authorities have been doing to try and dissuade people from going up the summit.
Well, I think this year they just really want to control it. Last year, there were over 220,000 people climbing in that very short climbing window. You have to remember Fuji's covered in snow for most of the year. The climbing season's quite short. So this year, particularly on the Yamanashi prefecture side, there are several entry points, but Yamanashi is the most popular entry point. They're restricting to 4,000 people a day. You have to register. You have to pay a small amount of money, and you can make an extra donation if you want to help with the maintenance of the mountain. The rubbish clear up is quite something. They're going to stop people doing what they call bullet climbing, which is when people try and go up at night very quickly and then get up there for sunrise, don't stay in one of the mountain huts on the way and come down in the morning. They don't want people to do that. They're generally encouraging people to do the 2-day climb where they go up and then they stay in a mountain hut, summit in a lot of people like to get there for sunrise. And then, they feel it's a bit more manageable, and that really the numbers have been getting out of control. And you've been getting some images from last year. I don't know if you've seen any, but it looked very, very crowded. And, it's bad for the mountain. It's a bad experience. And, potentially quite dangerous for people who are climbing if there are too many people up there.
There is this really tricky balance that Japan has to strike, doesn't it? Insofar as when you see the images of an overcrowded Mount Fuji and you hear of people putting their lives at risk or indeed taking unnecessary risks to climb the mountain, one wonders how productive and what the Japanese authorities can do. Blocking views or tearing down apartment blocks is a sort of a negative gesture. But is there any sort of argument to be had for positive encouragement, as you say, of people taking their time? Which are people responding to better?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the business you mentioned about the view of Mount Fuji being blocked, that's, not everybody supports that. And it's caused all sorts of problems. This is this famous view from a town near Mount Fuji where you have this incredible view of Mount Fuji with a convenience store in front of it. So it's the juxtaposition. And I think maybe this slightly reflects a bigger problem that's going on in Japan, which is a lot of people coming here, they want these photographs, these very specific views. So what you're getting in Japan is everybody seems to be going to the same 5 places and they want these very particular pictures. And it's just causing an amazing bottleneck in a few places. So I think there is definitely a balance to be found. There's no doubt there'll be more tourists coming to Japan this year than ever before. It's going to well sort of exceed pre-pandemic limits. And I think really Japan has to think, how can they get people to go to places beyond these few places they're going to? So we're talking about anywhere with a view of Mount Fuji. Hakone, this lake, which also has a view of Mount Fuji. Kyoto, pretty much unmanageable at the moment for visitors. So how do you get people to spread out in Japan a bit more?
And we now have this, the depreciation of the yen has partly been responsible for this enormous surge of tourists to Japan who basically work out that for the first time in a very, very long time, you can really, really have a huge experience. The fact is that Japan is having to try and manage its currency a little bit better, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a shock for Japan to discover that it's become a cheap destination. And there's a bit of adjusting to do. Certainly some places like Himeji Castle, very famous castle in the west of Japan, they're talking about maybe having a different entry fee for tourists. And you get that awkward balance. People here, all their restaurants are too crowded. People feel that for them, the cost of living has gone up, but for visitors, the cost of Japan has come down. So that's a slightly uncomfortable sort of meeting point of Japan with its visitors. I think people want to welcome visitors. I just think it's the concentration in a few places. I mean, I was in the north of Japan yesterday. Fantastic food, amazing temples, incredible weather. And it was empty. And I was just reflecting on, really, if people were prepared to go beyond these fixed points, there's a whole other Japan to explore.
Fiona Wilson, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Tokyo. You're listening to The Globalist, live on Monocle Radio. It's Friday, and it's time, therefore, to hear what Andrew Muller has to say about the last 7 days. Here's what we learned.
We learned this week that it actually is possible to somehow lose a bet even when you have advance notice of the result of the proposition upon which you are punting.
Ooh, I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
We learned this from the UK's Conservative Party, whose determination to tank next week's general election with as little dignity as possible has seemed at times to verge on the actually inventive. We learned specifically that several people close to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, including 6 police officers, some from Sunak's protection detail, and at least 2 actual Tory candidates, are now suspected of having hastened upon acquiring advance insider knowledge of the election date to their neighbourhood bookmaker.
How easy is it to have a bet?
Oh, it's so simple, Mike. All you do, you come up with your stakes to the friendly bookies, who's always smiling. And if you want to have, say, £5 on number 4, that's all you say. You walk away, you watch the race, you have a bit of fun.
Yes, some of them at least may have done it online. It's just that someone fiddling with a betting app does not lend itself to elegantly evocative sound effects, does it? We also learned that this was not exclusively a Tory foible, as we learned that the ranks of the opposition Labour Party, predicted by most polls to be sauntering to triumph, contain at least one candidate who is not complacent about their prospects of victory.
They suspended one of their own candidates. Kevin Craig put under investigation by the Gambling Commission, not for betting on the election date, but for betting on himself to lose his race.
We learned, however, that Kevin Craig may have spotted a value bet in central Suffolk and North Ipswich, where overturning a majority of some 23,000 votes was always going to be uphill work, even amid a national swing likely to rival the Russian Revolution, but where the odds on the incumbent might have been inflated by the optimism of Labour supporters, and perhaps now lengthened further by Craig's banishment over this indiscretion. There is still a decent-ish 4-11 on offer on Craig's Tory opponent keeping his seat. And we further learned when we looked up just now the odds on the election entire that you can still get £1.04 back for a £1 bet on a Labour majority, which, while vanishingly short odds for what is essentially a 2-horse race, is still a 4% return in a week and therefore significantly better than bank interest. Thank us after the exit polls. Anyway, in the election on the Atlantic's other shore...
Oh, no.
We learned that US President Joe Biden has been ordering the large-scale roundup of Christians, which you'd reckon would have made the news more often, but such, regrettably, is the degree to which the mainstream media is complicit in the Marxist subversion of the United States. Can I get some general muttered agreement?
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah.
We learned this naturally from former and perhaps future President Donald Trump as he burbled to an audience convened by the Faith and Freedom Coalition, who are, given Trump's general and indeed criminal record and in keeping with the precepts of their religion, clearly a forgiving bunch. We learned, if not for the first time, that a significant coterie of American Christians cannot embrace tightly enough a man who has probably been to church fewer times in his life than Joe Biden went last week, and who only ever interacts with the Bible when required to swear an oath before a judge, so slightly more often than the Pope, am I right? Or when attempting to sell one.
I'm proud to endorse and encourage you to get this Bible. We must make America pray again.
Still only $59.99. But we learned that the United States was not the only jurisdiction in which improbable claims were being made vis-à-vis the virtues of contestants in a popularity contest.
Everything is better with some cows around.
We learned that the annual contest for the much-coveted Miss Vaca Galicia trophy, awarded every year to the cow judged the most prepossessing in the Spanish region in question, was down to 4 contenders. Which may, yes, well sound like that. We learned, having not previously happened upon this, and therefore missed out on years of tap-in cow puns, that the Miss Vaca Galicia pageant is a whole thing, on television and everything. Here's a bit of last year's.
A misma vez íbamos a entrar todos. Coruña, que estaría 35 para Coruña, 34 Lugo.
Yes, we found that clip on MooTube. We learned that this year's finalists are Navarra, Cuca, Gallardo and Parula, and we learned that among the various cases made for them are, we are not making these up, even if we suspect the authors of these claims may be, that Parula is a Scorpio, which might be technically true, but who cares, and that Cuca enjoys bingo, though we are sceptical as to how one would tell, and that Gallardo is a fan of One Direction, particularly, we assume, of their song Don't Forget Where You Belong, Horn. Tragically, well, not tragically, we exaggerate for comic effect, the final results were not known by the time this episode of What We Learned was recorded, but we are certain the winner will be a worthy one and the voting carefully scrutinised as befits a contest involving such high stakes. Boo!
May you always have cows around.
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Thank you, Andrew. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
8:22 in Paris, 7:22 here in London. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio is a journalist and broadcaster, Nabila Ramdani, and author of the book Fixing France. Good morning, Nabila.
Good morning, Emma.
Good to see you. Just a quick reference there made by Andrew Muller in What We Learned about the betting scandal here in the United Kingdom. This has not stopped, and the coverage in the papers is growing in volume, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. There's actually a new development in the gambling scandal story that was exposed 2 weeks ago. But when it revealed that Craig Williams, who is Rishi Sunak's closest aide, was subject to an investigation by the Gambling Commission for betting that the election would be in July, just 3 days before it was called. Now, overall, we're learning that as many as 15 Conservatives candidates or officials are now believed to be under investigation over suspicion of betting on the date of the election. Now, the plot thickens because at least 7 Metropolitan Police officers are also under investigation over bets on the timing of the general elections. And what both the Gambling Commission and the Met are focusing on is whether the alleged use of confidential information constitutes cheating under criminal law. Now, I have to admit that none of this surprises me at all. I mean, gambling is undoubtedly part of British culture, and every time sometimes big is happening, then we have to hear about what the bookmaker has to say about it all. But in this case, I think the most sinister aspect is inside knowledge. And if nothing else, betting is at least meant to be fair. But if people are using inside information, then that part of course is potentially illegal.
There is the argument about putting the morals to one side and, the illegality and the potential law breaking that we're looking at here. There is that slight element of foolishness that if you do know and you are going to put a bet on, why not get someone who you know to do it for you quietly? I mean, there is that sort of slight idiocy or that sort of foolishness which you need to think, well, actually, regardless as to what your criminal or non-criminal intentions are, the practicalities are you don't show up any of these players in particularly intelligent light, does it?
Yes, indeed. I mean, one example of foolishness involved in this type of scandals is footballers recently have been prosecuted very recently for betting on games they're actually playing in. So there's no reason why it should not be the same for politicians and indeed policemen.
How much damage do you think it's done in terms of the way that the Conservatives campaign, clearly not in a good shape going into the election? But the fact is that Rishi Sunak seems to have been apologising every time he's started a debate. So he's gone in and he had to apologise for leaving D-Day commemorations early. Then he had to start the debate 2 days ago by saying, I'm really sorry about what's happened with the Gambling Commission. When you find yourself as a Prime Minister perpetually on the back foot, it doesn't look great.
No, not at all, especially from the political class and its entourage, who are meant to be sensible and moral and, showing how to conduct our lives the right way, and certainly in accordance with the rule of law. So this is not a great look, and there is no reason why authority figures should not be held to account when such misconduct happens or alleged misconduct.
Let's look at the coverage now of some extraordinary events in Bolivia in the last couple of days, where a former army general who'd had his sort of his epaulets stripped, then went and effectively parked tanks in front of the presidential palace, the presidential offices. How's that being covered now? Now that things have calmed down, because that general has now been arrested, but the rest of the world did step up in quite absolutely immediately to say, no, we have to preserve democracy here in Bolivia. This has to be stopped.
Yes, absolutely. That was the overarching goal, was to preserve democracy. And as you said, the commander involved in the coup has now been detained on suspicion of terrorism after he tried an armed uprising in the administrative capital, La Paz, against the president. Now, the coup has failed, but, foreign affairs are very bleak at the moment. And this Bolivia coup is yet another example of how intense violence continues to blight human life everywhere. It's quite extraordinary, this story of soldiers using armed force to take over the government. And in a way, it's as old as time itself. But so is the history of failed coups.
I know, when you look at the pictures, when you see, the streets of La Paz filled with military members with an armoured truck, and you see this, as you say, this is a timeless method of trying to solve a problem, and it's rarely one that succeeds.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in this case, there was literally an army truck which rammed into the presidential palace, and military units led by a revolutionary general launched the attack. But it was soon put down, and he was arrested on live television, which was clearly humiliating for him. But I think beyond the farcical nature of the coup, it pointed to a South American country with massive economic problems and a very unhappy population, clearly. Gas exports that helped to drive the country's economic miracle, as they call it, in the years 2000 have dried up, and it led to a dangerous decline in foreign reserves that are near zero. zero at the moment. And so protests have been building with many people unable to get dollars, and pressure on the long stable currency is rising. So sadly, this is the kind of story we've heard so often in South America.
Finally, Nabila, let's go to the Daily Mail, a rare spot of visitation by Monocle, but nonetheless we'll go there because it's talking about lawless London. And if you have a nice car, or rather particularly a rather stealable Land Rover, then owners are going to certain lengths to chain their cars to a tree.
This is an extraordinary story because effectively Land Rover owners have taken to extreme measures to protect their expensive car. There is a surge in thefts across London, and the Land Rovers have been dubbed Britain's most stolen car. And basically Land Rover owners have started to chain their cars to trees to avoid thieves pinching them within seconds. And this is because the car's keyless entry makes it easier for thefts to get in and indeed to steal the car in record time. And the paper shows a social media post with a Land Rover parked on a quiet, leafy residential street with a bike chain looped around a nearby tree and attached to the back of the expensive car.
I must confess there is a sort of neighbourhood watch scheme informally in our street where there is someone who does have a Land Rover, a Range Rover, and we literally look out of the window waiting for people to come and try and steal it. It's become almost like a slight joke, but the fact that the Daily Mail is calling it lawless London, I mean, we're talking about very posh cars in a nice leafy street.
Yes, absolutely. But I think it draws attention to, the old saying is that if you can't lock something down, it will be stolen. And it's proved to be true by this alarming story. So imagine having to literally have to lock your car to a tree to stop it being stolen. But it has to be said that the security industry is worth multi-billions nowadays, with new high-tech measures being developed every day. Yet people are reverting to the most basic security measure possible. So it says everything about the technology cycle. I think the original methods are doing something, that are often the best.
Nabila Randani, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's Globalist, a sneak peek into our new bureau in Paris.
We've found a place where there's an element of excitement about the urban environment. Of course, challenges, lots of people have different views on what that should be. But we'll see what happens in Paris over the coming weeks and months.
That's all to come on today's Globalist. But first, with the time 7:31 here in London, a quick summary of what else we're keeping an eye on today. European Union leaders have agreed to nominate Germany's centre-right politician Ursula von der Leyen for a second 5-year term as President of the European Commission, the EU's powerful executive body. At a summit in Brussels, the bloc's 27 national leaders also picked the former Portuguese Premier Antonio Costa as the future chair of their European Council meetings, and the Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas will be the next EU foreign policy chief. Meanwhile, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban voted against Frau von der Leyen and Ms Kallas. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni abstained from the vote on von der Leyen but voted against Costa and Kallas for their posts. In other news, at least 6 people have been killed after an international express train collided with a bus on a level crossing in Slovakia. The crash happened late in the afternoon, around 80 kilometres east of the capital Bratislava. And schools in the US state of Oklahoma have been ordered to incorporate the Bible into their lessons. The state's senior education official said the rule requires immediate and strict compliance. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It has been almost 4 years since Joe Biden and Donald Trump faced each other in a US presidential election. Much has changed for both men. One has been incumbent in the White House, but large question marks hang over his cognitive sharpness. The other is now a convicted criminal with a fistful of legal cases to face. Well, these two candidates met at the CNN HQ in Atlanta last night, where the only props they were allowed were a pen, a notepad and a bottle of water. No notes allowed. Well, to go through a headline-hitting debate. I'm joined in the studio now by Monocle's US editor, Chris Lord. Hello, Chris.
Hi, good morning, Emma.
Right, so when we're looking at the headlines, just the immediate takeaway is the word struggles.
That was an ugly debate. It was ugly scenes in Atlanta last night. I think anybody hoping to find a debate in any of that hour and a half of discourse will be sorely disappointed, I'm afraid. There is barely any policy in the exchanges. It is mudslinging, accusations, and unfortunately, it couldn't really have gone any worse for President Joe Biden.
Tell us why.
He arrived sounding hoarse with a sore throat, which unfortunately, at a moment when he is being accused of being frail and not really knowing exactly what's going on at times, in the silence of a studio that had no audience in it, unusual for one of these debates, it just brought the spotlight back to all those concerns and accusations that he's faced in recent weeks. Now what you're hearing are very real concerns. At the moment, backgrounders, so at the moment, anonymous Democrats, lawmakers, party strategists saying the time has come for Joe Biden to step aside and find a successor to go into this debate, into this election with. And I think what you're going to see in the next few weeks is somebody very senior in the party, Congress or otherwise, senators, whatever it might be, or a grandee in the Democrats, break ranks and go on the record and say this is the moment, looking towards the Democratic National Convention in August when Joe Biden says the jig's up.
Let's have a little listen to just a moment when President Biden is struggling. Let's hear it.
More Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
I mean, we have that. Obviously, Biden's struggling and struggling to get his words out, although it requires several listens before we understand it. And that's the real problem here, because you can't listen backwards. Whereas what you have there with Trump, arguably, is not the bombastic, loud, angry candidate. You have someone who's dialing the volume down, and it's working.
The expectation going into this last night was that in the absence of a studio audience, Trump would flail a little bit. He wouldn't have that momentum behind him that he normally has when he says something outlandish. The audience laughs or there's a gasp of shock, and therefore he kind of sort of hurries him on to the next thing, and he ends up looking very, as you say, very bombastic. Actually, as you say, Emma, and you're right, in a way, what he does is he dials it right down. They didn't even really have to use the mute button that they put in specifically to stop him from talking over the other candidate. And in fact, actually what he does, if you watch that debate, he spends the entire time signing to the cameras what he thinks about what Joe Biden's saying. And it's childish stuff. As Joe Biden is speaking, he's pulling faces, he's looking surprised, shocked, mock kind of surprise, I guess you could say. This wasn't a great night for Donald Trump, to be clear. I mean, there's incredible moments if you're actually listening to the debate where Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, the moderators from CNN, ask him repeatedly, what are you going to do about childcare? Americans can't afford to pay for childcare. What are you going to do? Trump simply does not answer the question. Several times he's asked, all he does is go back and accuse Joe Biden of being the worst president in history over and over and over again. But unfortunately, that's not going to be the story this morning as Americans wake up and look back on what happened last night. I think the bigger problem here is that everybody thought that quieter, more sort of serious debate without the kind of audience participation and so on would hand something to Joe Biden. The trouble is, what you saw if you watch is that under stress, he falls into the Trump trap. He says he has the morals of an alley cat. He gets into mudslinging as well. He doesn't look presidential. And I think that's going to be the bit that really people, when they pick through this, are going to find. And I think we're going to hear it in a second. There's a very long exchange towards the end where they argue about their golf handicap.
Let's have a listen to them arguing about the golf handicap.
I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6. I told you before, I'm happy to play golf if you carry your own bag. Think you can do it? That's the biggest lie. He's a 6 handicap of all. I was an 8 handicap. Yeah. 8. Never. But I have, I've seen you swing. I know you swing.
Okay, so just looking at our body language in the room, we are both sort of massively putting ourselves in a defensive position. It's a sort of an instinctive listen to that, and you just think, this is a bad situation for absolutely everybody, isn't it?
My shoulders are up by my ears, Emma. I have to say, it's a hard listen. It's a hard watch last night. And even just that. But just imagine being out in one of these cities in America that are struggling right now and seeing, frankly, 2 very men of advanced age debating their golf swing and golf handicap. at this moment.
Not relevant to any voter apart from those two men on the stage.
And Emma, these debates do matter. There can be a way to assume that this is all just circus. It's still quite early in the debates, in the election cycle, to have a debate like this. But these debates do matter. Let's just go back to the very, very first TV debate in America, Kennedy v. Nixon, when, just like Joe Biden, Nixon arrived with a cold, not feeling very well, and it didn't go well for him ultimately in that election. I think now, there is fears here, I think, that history might repeat itself. And I wonder what happens when we get to the convention for the Democrat Party in August, whether that machinery within the party, because when I talk to comms people, strategists within that party, what they say to me is, as it was put to me once by very long-standing strategists, we're in Jonestown these days. No one's saying the truth. No one's saying what's actually going on. We all know this is going to cost Congress people their seats, and it's going to weaken the party. We've got to act. And I think you're going to hear that discourse get louder and louder in the days and weeks ahead.
Chris Lord, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, all this week on The Globalist, we've been going through our annual Quality of Life survey, ranking the world's top 20 most livable cities. If you missed yesterday's episode, the city that came out on top this year was Munich. Well, today we want to go beyond the headlines and turn our focus to a new entry in this year's ranking and talk about the cities that didn't make it and why. Monocle's senior foreign correspondent Carlotta Rebello sat down with Monocle's editor Josh Fennett and foreign editor Alexis Self. She began by asking Alexis about this year's newest edition, Barcelona.
A big part of our decision-making is how well cities and their governments react to things, and there's no way that any government can be completely present. And Barcelona particularly, I think, has suffered from some urban issues that have affected lots of cities, and particularly in the Mediterranean in the past few years. Mass tourism, water shortages, droughts, and kind of general environmental strain. And I think the interesting thing that we're seeing in Barcelona is a regional government and a city government responding to those with kind of progressive initiatives and ones that take into account the views of local citizens. So that was a big part of thinking around that. Barcelona had become a byword for dysfunctional over-tourism, and the city government is responding to that through progressive taxation and through consultation with citizens, and it is having a material effect on the lives of the people who live there.
Are there lessons there from Barcelona for other cities, perhaps, which might allow them to rank in our survey going forward? It's quite interesting to have a city that, as Alexis was describing, has grappled so much with the issue of over-tourism, for example, and is trying to remediate that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Barcelona is sometimes mentioned in the same breath as a Venice, as a Reykjavik, as an Amsterdam, as a place where the physical confines of the city are limiting the number of people who can come in. And also you get into these funny debates about the good tourist. Who is the good tourist? How much money do they spend? How long do they spend there? And what do they give back? I think Barcelona fundamentally is a beautiful city that has experimented with interesting urbanism, the superblock concept. It's sunny, it has beaches, it has access to the Balearics. And the Catalan capital has come back again and again, year after year, because it's such an interesting place for entrepreneurship. It's a place where people still make things. It's a place of art, creativity. You can go to a great cinema, you can go to a great bar, you can stay up all night partying, or you can, well, in certain neighbourhoods anyway, depending on your budget, afford to live there as well. And I think that is the balance that cities are striving to take. You could look at a Stockholm and say the city has struggled with integrating its population. You could look at an Athens and see the situation with the heat waves, which we've discussed in previous dispatches. You could look at Milan and see its same struggle with over-tourism at certain times in the summer. But ultimately, these are great places to live, and people flock there because they're beautiful, because they're historic, because they're awe-inspiring. And also, that's one thing that we want to bring to people as well. Cities should be enjoyable places to spend a bit of time or a lot of time. And so when we do these rankings and when we do the entire issue, we want to talk about the benchmarks. We want to talk about the positivity and the good steps, and not just dwell on the fact that some cities have troubles, because ultimately we're sitting recording this in London, a city with a rap sheet as long as any of our arms, probably all outstretched and all together, but which has great virtues about it. Doesn't make the ranking this year, as it hasn't in the past, for various reasons. But when we talk about crunching these numbers, you could talk about the length of commute. Maybe that comes down to how big a city is. But ultimately, when you're inside that city, it might come down to whether you get home at lunchtime and see your family or not. And that's actually what we're trying to do. And Barcelona, for all its trials and tribulations, for the way that it's upping its tourist tax to line the city's coffers, for the struggles it's had with regulating Airbnbs, has come out as a positive, interesting place to base your business, to make something and to live. And ultimately, that's what we're looking to celebrate with this survey as well. Not saying that all of these cities are perfect or polished or impeccable or couldn't be improved, but rather the improvements they're making could be elaborated elsewhere. And I think that's the part of the constructive journalism we try to do here at Monocle.
Well, let's stay more or less on this topic of the improvements or what cities could do better. I would like to turn the focus now of those who didn't make it this year. And one omission of the ranking are American cities. And that's often asked every year when we release this ranking, why do American cities not feature in our survey? And maybe I would like to give the chance to explain why and what American cities could be doing better to perhaps find a spot in our top 20.
We obviously love the US as a publication. It's our biggest market, so we do present this information at our peril to some extent. But look, the conversations that we're having within this survey don't say anywhere that Los Angeles isn't a great place to have a staffed bureau, as we've had for many years. It doesn't say anywhere that Greenwich Village isn't a great place to have your first US shop, as Monocle did for many years. We know that New York and Los Angeles and Miami and Seattle and a lot of major coastal cities are doing incredible things globally. But as Alexis says, there's a little bit of a disconnect between the high and the low, which makes it quite hard. That the crime rate's persistently, stubbornly high. And the US also has, well, I'm going to call it an issue because I can, a problem with getting people back to the office in a way that Europe has managed, I would say, slightly better. So commercial vacancies are a big problem in lots of cities. Office space are a big problem in lots of cities, but I think it's most acute in the US at the minute. And also, we try and get into the weeds of the statistics, but ultimately there is a question of feeling, and we do speak to a lot of readers who are leaving the US who wonder about what another Republican president might look like come November and how that will affect the state of the city. So what we should say to American listeners is that there are cities that come close, places like Austin, for instance, you know, a huge influx of extremely talented people, a street life that's been preserved, a walkable middle of town. You know, when we did an event in Dallas, even we saw an amazing benchmark for getting people back downtown, back into the centre of a city. But I wouldn't say there's a single US city that's done all of that in a way that we could countenance putting next to, say, a Copenhagen for its walkability, its cleanliness, its provision for something for all. But it's all to play for the US. We see how things slide, we see how things change over the years. And Europe has a certain way of doing things, but that's not to say it's the right way of doing things always. In this year's ranking, with the way that we slanted the metrics, Europe has come out emphatically on top, I think it's fair to say. But that's not to say next year isn't to play for.
I think there really is a small city boom in the US. You know, people are finding what they're looking for in smaller cities. And as Josh says, a big part of that, I think, is the kind of physical space and the distances involved. I don't think it's a secret that we're interested in places where commerce and culture and residential life are all a short walk away from each other. You know, we like mixed, and obviously the Urbanist talks about this a lot. We like mixed neighbourhoods, and obviously North American cities, because of the way they were built and designed, this is less common. So that's a big factor. And you know, it's still in the conversation. And we talk about Latin America as well, a region not famed for quality of life in urban areas, but we have a piece in here, a column in the survey, 3 Latin American cities that are kind of bucking the trend when it comes to reputation for quality of life in the region.
That was Monocle's Josh Fennett and Alexis Self talking to Carlotta Rebello. And there you have it. That recaps this year's edition of our Quality of Life survey. But don't worry, there's plenty more to discover. You can pick up a copy of our July-August double issue, which is available from today in all good newsstands, to find out more about what makes a good city. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Now to Paris, where Monocle has just opened a new bureau in the Marais. Monocle's editor-in-chief, Andrew Tuck, sat down with our deputy head of radio, Tom Webb, to talk about the exciting new edition. And Tom began by asking Andrew why it had to be in the City of Light.
Well, Paris has always been important to Monocle, but I think over the last few years we've just seen a growth in interest in stories coming out of France for our readers. So whether it's the music industry, whether it's museums and culture, architecture, design, just so many stories hitting page in Monocle and being told here on the radio as well, that we realised it was time to make a bigger commitment there. We're also a business. I'll be clear that the decision where we build up big offices is also because we have partners in those cities. So we have done a huge amount of work with amazing partners in France, many on the fashion brand side, for example, but also at a city level, that we also felt this was a good time to be there. Just for example, we've just done a great companion, one of these paperback books that goes on to newsstand, 50 essays. And it was done in partnership with Saint-Gobain, which is one of these amazing, huge French companies that does a huge amount of building materials, helps build our cities, is behind many of the skyscrapers and the projects that you see being raised from the ground. So lots of reasons to be there. And as I think a few people may have noticed, there's one or two stories hitting the headlines of late that also make it a good news gathering spot.
And let's talk about one of those headlines. Let's turn to the Olympics. Now, Monocle Radio is going to be there for 2 weeks for full coverage. How has the magazine touched on the Olympics so far?
Well, we've done a few things in the run-up to the Games. We're always interested in the crossover between sporting events and soft power. So we've looked at some of the athletes attending these Games and what it means for their nations to have a sportsman or woman competing there in Paris. We've also been trying to look at what the legacy will be for these Games, and not only in Paris. In the current issue, we returned to Munich actually to look at a piece of legacy there with the athlete stadium and how it became a place where people really want to live in that city. So trying to touch on what legacy will mean for Paris. And over time, we've been out of the centre. We've been to Saint-Denis to look at the work being done there. So again, as outsiders, when we go to Paris or any city, it's very easy to be seduced. But when you go to the outskirts, when you go to the banlieue, you see that there are many communities that need a helping hand. And actually, there is the one piece of legacy. They're not building many buildings for the Paris Games, but they're building this amazing aquatic centre. And in the neighbourhood around there in Saint-Denis, the hope is that this will give people pride, it will give people job opportunities, it will help revitalise a space that needs it.
So beyond our editorial coverage, what is Monocle's new physical commitment to Paris going forward?
Physical, I think, to look good and handsome, hey? So that'd be my physical commitment. Might take a little bit of effort. No,
we've been doing that for years already.
We're going to start. We're at the starting point. So we have just literally cut the ribbon on a new office, which is just on the edge of the Marais. And it's a compact office, but we're going to have a bureau chief there. We're going to have one or two of our staff here from London who are relocating to Paris. And we're also going to have a commercial presence there as well. So we'll have a nice squad there. But we have big ambitions for Paris. And the estate agents and the realtors of Paris are already being called up because we hope in the coming months to announce a much bigger presence in the city that will hopefully include retail, a radio studio so we can do stuff like this in Paris, and also a space for the cafe as well. So we want to be there, not behind closed doors, but we want to be there with a welcoming mat in Paris as well, because it's worked super well for us in Zurich at Dufourstrasse, and there you see the kind of the life that begins to evolve around a great bureau. And here in London too, when you see the cafe, it's the cafe is a place to go and get a coffee, but the number of people you bump into who have come to see that cafe because they want to be part of the Monocle world and they want to hear what we're doing, see what we're doing, and that's the ambition for Paris as well.
Monocle's Andrew Tuck there in conversation with Tom Webb. The time here in London is 7:53. Time now for a quick look at film and the world of cinema with the critic Karen Krasanovic. She joins me in the studio now. Good morning. Welcome back, Karen.
Well, we've got a fast look at Isabelle Huppert winning the Lumiere Prize.
Tell us a little bit more about, just explain the legend of Isabelle Huppert for people who haven't encountered this woman with this astonishing sort of canon of brilliant French films and American ones too. Well, she's now been given the Lumiere Award.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's 71, although you wouldn't know it when I saw her on the catwalk red carpet, excuse me, as a Freudian slip. She's been working on, she's got 156 acting credits to her name. She's worked with auteurs from the French New Wave to Asian cinema to European cinema and American independence. She's a favorite of directors all over the place. And the New York Times actually said that she's second in the list of best actors of all time.
It is incredible that actually when you think of best actors of all time, one immediately gravitates towards Hollywood. Yet France has produced Isabelle Huppert. That we still have to explain who she is to lots and lots of viewers.
Well, you will have seen her, but you may not have recognized her. She's known for her portrayals of sort of cold women who have no morality. So if you see somebody like that who speaks French, she's one of the greatest actresses of all time, of course, with 16 nominations and 2 wins. She's got César, BAFTA, Lumiere, Berlin Awards, nominations at Cannes, Golden Globe, and an Academy Award nomination as well. And it's difficult. I mean, everybody's got their favorite Isabelle Huppert movie, if you know of her. She's quite petite. She's got a kind of angular face, and she also has a lot of freckles. So a lot of people go, "Oh, it's the lady with the freckles."
And the relevance of the Lumiere Festival in Lyon, it's a sort of classic film festival, isn't it?
It is. I mean, since 2009, they've been giving an award for a cinema personality for the entire body of their work. And at this point, Isabelle Huppert has been, she was born in 1953, and she has worked for several films virtually every year of her career. So it's really quite incredible. But the range of what she can do is what's really astonishing.
Let's talk a little bit about, this is not that long since there was a sort of terrible incident involving Singapore Airlines, and already they're making a documentary about it. I mean, this is called, I think, what was described as a fast turnaround. What's all this about?
Fast turnaround, yeah. Well, okay. There's a Singapore Airlines turbulence documentary that is being funded now by several different TV companies across the world. Australia, Germany, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, and the UK, as well as Belgium and Switzerland, are all adding money into this documentary about the tragic turbulence issue that happened in Singapore Airlines in February this year, where one person died of a heart attack, and then there was a UK man who was left with life-changing injuries from this. And I think it's because there's a fascination with true life horror, and also the fact that turbulence is supposed to be increasing now due to climate change.
It's interesting. I know that in the Nelson household there is quite a lot of those documentaries about terrible things happening in the air. They seem to be a perpetual favourite on the screens in our lounge. There is that fascination, isn't there? Especially with things like the Boeing 737-800 scandal. Then we have the MH17 scandal, and you have what is always amazing is you have these strange theories that are posited to explain exactly what happened, and then that just sort of becomes dissipated in dreadful conversations over dinner. It does with the Singapore Airlines. It's one of those things that you hope that clear-headed and factual contributors are going to be included in this, rather than wild conspiracy theorists.
I hope with the amount of money and the amount of interest it's getting, I think it's going to have to be quite factual. Although what I suspect will happen is that the factual one will come out first, sort of like the Thai cave boys being stuck, and also the miners in South America that were stuck. We waited a long time for those movies. This one we're not having to wait for. So I think we'll get the documentary, and then we'll get a fictional version right after.
And we have the glorious knowledge that everyone filmed it happening as well. So the movie is made immediately. I mean, that really changes the way things are done now, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this plane dropped 176 feet in 4 seconds, and Bradley Richard, who's the UK man who was left with 6 fractures in his spine, I'm sure he's not going to be entertained by this film, but he did say it was right out of a movie.
Karen Krasanovic, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist, and that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers too, Laura Kramer and Tom Webb. Our research was George Ruskin and our studio manager, Mariella Bevan, with editing assistance from Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The Briefing is live at midday here in London. Hope you can join me for that if you can. And The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great weekend.